Contents cover inserts title page Chapter 3 Chapter 4 Epilogue Information Chapter 3 Woe. As Hamsuk started climbing up the wall, Ainz's body, which was straddling Hamsuk, hung parallel to the ground. If he had not activated the fly spell through a magical item to free himself from the restraints of gravity, this could have been quite troublesome. If he were to fall from this height, would Ainz's body receive any damage? The answer would be a resounding no. However, he had to avoid letting any third party see him tumbling off Hamsuk in such an undignified manner. He had to maintain his reputation as Momonga, the adamantite-ranked adventurer. Since he had never fallen off his horse or rather, his hamster before, he wasn't sure whether his reputation would suffer from such an act. Perhaps people would be understanding and think it was natural to have such mishaps when riding a powerful magical beast like Hamsuk, but that was probably wishful thinking. Of course, Ainz had quite a few complaints. To be forthright, Ainz's evaluation of Hamsuk as a mount was incredibly low. Soul Eaters were far superior in comparison. As for comfort, if asked whether it was satisfactory, he would have to tilt his head in uncertainty. First off, Hamsuk's fur was admittedly fairly soft under normal circumstances. At such times, one could say the comfort level exceeded the passing mark. However, this appraisal would be completely reversed during combat. This was because when preparing for battle, Hamsuk's fur would harden. Moreover, she was unable to selectively keep just her back soft, her entire body would become like a bed of nails. While this was fine for Ainz, ordinary humans would likely definitely end up being stabbed by countless thin, hard hairs. Next was the fact that he had to spread his legs extremely wide just to ride her. Though this issue had been improved somewhat with the use of a specialized saddle, it was still extremely difficult to stabilize himself by gripping the horse's or rather, the hamster's body with his thighs and knees. Even someone with superhuman abilities like Ainz could barely endure it. An ordinary person would find it necessary to secure their lower body to the specialized saddle with ropes. Despite Hamsuk's faults, everyone considered her an amazing magical beast for reasons beyond Ainz's understanding, which needlessly raised the bar for maintaining appearances. He was extremely dissatisfied. I remember someone telling me before that even elegant ducks frantically paddle their feet underwater to one that almost fits me to a T. Still, if there's a wall, and you're wondering what to do, jumping on it is something you should tell me beforehand. Unlike horses, you can talk, after all. Ainz grumbled, his body being violently jerked back and forth in time with Hamsuk's movements. She should show a little more consideration for the person on her back. Well, since there haven't been any incidents so far, I suppose Hamsuk must have faith in me not to fall off. Even so, he wished Hamsuk would spare him from climbing vertical walls. Perhaps clinging to her back would improve the situation, but what kind of impression would that give to onlookers? Would they understand, or would they think it uncool? Or perhaps maintaining his current posture, perpendicular to Hamsuk, looked even stranger? Having finally reached the top of the wall, Hamsuk leaped into the tower grounds and landed with an appropriate thud. She then once again broke into a run. Riding on top, Ainz's head bobbed up and down vigorously. The shaking was so severe that an ordinary person would have undoubtedly gotten whiplash. While being grateful for his undead nature, Ainz surveyed the grounds of the one. Ainz is misremembering the saying calm as a swan above waters, but frantic feet are paddling underneath. Broken tower. First, he noticed the 3 skeletal dragons. Next, since the undead appeared to be attacking something, he suspected that there were living creatures here, and indeed he noticed several humans. Based on the information that Ainz had gathered beforehand, the probability was very high that there were other humans inside the broken tower as well. Avoiding any attacks that would include the broken tower shouldn't be a problem, right? Though since I'm posing as Momonga the warrior, I can't make use of area of effect magic even if I wanted to. Of course, it would be different if he were to use an item, but he had no intention of needlessly revealing his hand. For that reason, it would be better not to have Narbarl participate in this battle until the very last moment. How many times has this made it now that Momon the adamantite-ranked adventurer has helped someone? Even though Momon isn't particularly friendly with Nazarick, helping people in small ways will never be a waste, and will continue to be important going forward. The reason he had come here was that to reach the interior of the Katze plains, passing through the locations known as the Broken Towers was the most straightforward route. He hadn't expected to encounter skeletal dragons at the very first tower. Ainz tried to assess the situation between the skeletal dragons and the adventurers or those who appeared to be adventurers. If he swooped in to steal their kill, it would be impossible to avoid dispute. However, their formation seemed to have collapsed, and they looked like they would be grateful if he slew the skeletal dragons. Also, was that bear squaring off against one of the skeletal dragons someone's pet? Gazaru Gazaru Gazaru! Hamsuk charged forward while making embarrassing sounds. The ones he should crush first were the two skeletal dragons blocking the escape route to the tower. Whether this thought had been conveyed to Hamsuk or whether Hamsuk had come to the same conclusion herself, she charged straight for them. The skeletal dragon exchanging blows with the bear continued its battle, while the other two dragons began to move. They seemed to be targeting Hamsuk rather than the humans. They were moving to execute a pincer attack. Do they consider Hamsuk a threat? Considering a single skeletal dragon, its level should be much lower than Hamsuk's. Beasts would flee, but I suppose undead that know no fear wouldn't choose the option to retreat. Or perhaps they simply couldn't perceive the difference in their perspective levels, or lacked the intelligence to know when to retreat. The distance to the skeletal dragon furthest from the wall, the one nearest to the broken tower, was considerable, but with Hamsuk's leg strength, it was covered in an instant. Is it not time, my lord? The skeletal dragon was right before them. However, Ainz was unable to swing his sword. He had never fought while mounted before. His lack of experience had caught up with him, and he could not judge the distance. Especially with monsters like dragons that could attack with their tails, since the tail wasn't visible from the front, his sense of distance inevitably became distorted. Moreover, Hamsuk's large size made it inherently difficult to gauge distances properly. What do ordinary warriors do when attacking while mounted? Should he attack now? Or should he draw them in closer? With a weapon like a lance, he could simply charge straight ahead, but he wasn't quite sure what to do with his greatsword. Perhaps the best approach was to graze past them, then attack at the point of closest approach? Look out! Goza! A wall-like mass of white bones, the skeletal dragon's tail struck Ainz's chest with tremendous force. However, even though he had deactivated his passive skill, the pain was minimal. The force of the blow sent Ainz flying off of Hamsuk into mid-air. Naturally, since he had the fly spell active, it was easy to control his position in the air, but he chose not to use that power and instead rolled across the ground. Then he jumped to his feet. He considered whether he should act out being damaged a little, but decided that as the hero Momon, it wouldn't seem strange to stand up unfazed. This is difficult. While he had trained in combat with Cocytus, mounted combat had not been a part of the lessons. He would need to train for various situations like this in the future. Ainz pondered such things while lightly brushing the dirt from his armor. It was probably stuck all over him, but he didn't have time to clean it all off. To be grooming himself in the rear while the adventurers were fighting for their lives would certainly draw criticism. Hamsuk. I shall leave this one to you. Gain some experience. Understood, that it is. Hearing that response, Ainz shifted his gaze toward the adventurers without moving his head. I will take care of the remaining two. You adventurers over there, you wouldn't mind if I cut in, would you? If you'd rather I didn't interfere, I can just stand back and watch. This was a question he should have asked first. Who would have thought that his inability to time his attack would work out for the best? While people probably wouldn't complain about interference if they were being saved from mortal danger, they might criticize such discourteous behavior if their opponents were ones they could comfortably defeat. Can you take them? A natural question was posed. These were adventurers he couldn't recall seeing at the guild in Iruntal. Unfortunately, they might not know of Momon's strength. No, even if they did, they had just witnessed him get blown away by the skeletal dragon's tail strike. It was understandable for them to doubt his abilities. It won't be a problem. Putting on an act to make his voice sound powerful, he moved to stand before the skeletal dragon, taking over from the male warrior. He conceded the first move to the skeletal dragon. It felt like he had already conceded the first move earlier, but that must have just been his imagination. He needed to put on a good show here to put the others at ease. While deflecting the approaching claws with his sword, Ainz stole a glance at the other skeletal dragon, the one fighting the bear. The bear was heavily battered and showed no signs of being able to fight much longer. Can I defeat it before that bear gives out? No, unfortunately, with just my abilities as a warrior, it doesn't seem likely. With his free hand, Ainz pointed at the skeletal dragon fighting the bear, then gave a thumbs up before turning it downward. If the signal was understood, good. If not, it wouldn't matter since he wouldn't lose anyway. Ainz returned his gaze to his immediate opponent. Just as he was about to attack, its claws came rushing in. Ainz snorted in amusement. For Ainz, who had received some training and become accustomed to wielding a sword, deflecting the skeletal dragon's claw attacks was a simple matter. However, the truth was that he didn't need to defend at all from the very start. This was because Ainz could nullify all physical attacks below level 60. Barring a few exceptions, there was no point in defending against attacks below that level. However, there were witnesses present. Presenting too inhuman an appearance might arouse suspicion. Well, it turned out well last time, but how will it go this time? Alright. Let's try using a martial art. After reactivating high-tier physical nullification 3, Ainz turned his back. He would spin around and deliver a strike empowered by centrifugal force to the skeletal dragon. To be blunt, at this distance and timing, performing a full rotation right in front of an enemy was insane. No matter how you looked at it, the enemy's attack would hit first, while his accuracy would drop significantly. That was why he reactivated his skill. Even if he failed and the enemy's attack hit first, Ainz wouldn't flinch at all. The goal was to make observers think he must have used a defensive martial art while simultaneously using a spinning offensive martial art. And then, with his centrifugal force enhanced, strike its tail. The tail and Ainz's strike collided, knocking back the skeletal dragon's tail. Ainz was astounded. What an incredible stroke of luck! Since he had been facing backward, he hadn't noticed at all, but apparently the skeletal dragon had attacked with its tail just as Ainz struck. His swinging sword had coincidentally collided with it mid-air. It looked like I did that on purpose, didn't it? Though it had transpired entirely by chance, he had countered his opponent's attack while landing his own. To the onlookers, it must have looked like he had brilliantly intercepted the approaching tail of bones. That's right. If I act like that was what I was aiming for, wouldn't that seem fitting for an adamantite-ranked adventurer, and also rather stylish? Or wait, would it be considered normal for an adamantite-ranked adventurer to do something like this? The skeletal dragon staggered, pulled along by its forcefully repelled tail. It might have been a little too flashy, but if I say this was a martial art, it should be okay, right? He had been asked numerous times by adventurers in Iruntal about what original martial arts he had developed. That was why Momon of Darkness, the adamantite-ranked adventurer, needed to produce techniques that resembled martial arts. That was how this martial art-like technique he had displayed when Demiurge was rampaging in the royal capital became secret sword technique turning wheel. Ainz whispered the name he had just decided on for the spinning slash in his mind. Originally, or rather, when he used it in the royal capital, it was a technique where he swung his sword with all his might, letting the centrifugal force spin his body around once before returning to his starting position. Though he called it a technique, it wasn't anything of the sort. In truth, it was just an attempt to forcibly regain his balance after accidentally losing it during combat, which resulted in an acrobatic-like movement. It was the kind of technique that deserved a scolding for swinging a sword in a way that would throw him off balance. However, if he didn't prepare at least one technique that resembled a martial art, there might come a time when he couldn't bluff his way through, so this was a technique he had mastered through dozens of training sessions. To be honest, it didn't succeed very often, but when it did, it was a pretty cool move. This time, it was an improved version. It was really just a spinning slash, and there was no doubt that simply putting two tenrin means turning wheel, but it also has Buddhist connotations. Chakravartin, the Sanskrit concept for an ideal universal ruler, means through whom the wheel of the Dharma is turning, and is translated as, literally wheel turning. Saint King proper force into a normal strike would be more powerful. However, by adding unnecessary movements, he could make onlookers think it must have some special effect. Is that a weird name? Ainz was aware that his naming sense wasn't very good. He couldn't imagine that the first name that popped into his head would be any good. In that case, how about Mare Go Attack? I suspect that's not much better than the previous one, but well, since it's the second name that comes to mind, I hope it's decent enough. While idly pondering such things, Ainz pressed forward. His next customer was nearby. He couldn't spend too much time on just this one. The slightly larger skeletal dragon that had presumably killed the bear came charging in. He wouldn't mind fighting 2-on-1, but he had already given instructions beforehand. Just as the skeletal dragon extended its neck to bite, Narbarrel fell from the sky and smashed its head with the long sword in her hand. The skeletal dragon's head, upon receiving a heavy impact, was slammed into the ground with great force. The fact that solely the part from its neck forward was knocked to the ground was possible only because it was an undead with a false body construction, lacking skin, flesh, and tendons to transfer force. But to Ainz, it looked a bit cartoonish and made him want to laugh. Even though I was ordered to stand by, I hope this was acceptable. Yes, perfect timing. It seemed that his signal had been properly interpreted. Forgive me. I shall end this one quickly, so please buy me some time. Narbarrel would win without any issue. However, if the magic caster Nabe were to defeat a skeletal dragon using only a sword, it would stand out too much. Having her focus solely on defense and buying time was probably the absolute limit of what would be acceptable. Moreover, if it appeared that the warrior Momon had completely entrusted the role of tank to the magic caster Nabe, his capabilities as a warrior might be called into question. After all, a proper warrior served as the vanguard, acting as a reliable shield for the squishies. After Narbarrel indicated her understanding with a gesture, Ainz shifted his gaze just in time to see the skeletal dragon he had been fighting attempting to sweep at him from the side with its claws. He dodged, stepped in, and delivered a strike to its body with his sword gripped in both hands. Defeating it with just a sword is a bother after all. It would be faster to dominate the undead and have them fight each other, but doing so would arouse suspicion. His opponent was an undead with intelligence only on the order of kill the living. Without considering retreat, it extended its neck toward Ainz, trying to bite and chew on him. Like a batter, Ainz took a half-body stance, drew back his sword, then took a heavy step and delivered a full horizontal swing. The way the white skull was blown back resembled a grotesque parody of baseball. This time, Ainz had struck with the flat of his blade. Skeleton-type monsters such as Ainz himself were completely resistant to piercing attacks but extremely vulnerable to bludgeoning attacks. He hadn't bothered with this until now since he had time, but he needed to defeat it quickly and go help Narbarrel. It was farcical that the appearance of his partner had instead left him with less time to spare. "Playtime is over." He said this loud enough for the adventurers to overhear. In truth, he didn't consider this to be playtime at all. He only said that because he thought it might make him sound cool, or that it sounded like something an adamantite-ranked adventurer would say, but that was about it. However, Ainz regretted it immediately after saying it. Even though he had declared that playtime was over, it didn't mean that his method of attack would change. If there was something obvious like his sword bursting into flames, it would be a different matter, but all Ainz could do was simply continue wailing on it. In that case, this is the only option. He cast a spell that had been modified with metamagic. Silent Magic Perfect Warrior. Then, being careful not to use his full strength, he stepped in. Even while holding back, his speed was more than twice as fast as before now that he had the stats of a level 100 warrior. He invaded his opponent's space in less than an instant, faster than the skeletal dragon was able to react. Feeling his legs, hips, torso, and chest coordinate effortlessly in perfect harmony, he channeled that momentum into his great sword as it raced through the skeletal dragon's neck. The execution was carried out faster than the eye could blink. Without sparing a glance at the falling skull, Ainz turned on his heel and began to slowly walk toward Narbarrel. Narbarrel was following his orders, focusing entirely on defense and skillfully handling its attacks. While he probably should have hurried, he didn't for two reasons. First, he was confident that Narbarrel would be fine, and second, he thought that walking in a self-assured manner would be more fitting for the hero Momon. One strike. He had forgotten earlier, so he announced it loud enough for the adventurers to hear. His goal was to minimize any suspicion about his sudden increase in strength by declaring that he had done it intentionally. He would be pleased if they thought he had finally gotten serious, or had used a martial art. At worst, they would recognize it as something he could do because of the accumulated damage it had been dealt so far probably. If they didn't accept that, he could just insist on it. He could even resort to pulling rank by accusing them of doubting the judgment of an adamantite-ranked adventurer. If he had any regret, it was that announcing it beforehand would have been cooler. The reason he had not done so was that he wasn't confident he could kill it in one strike. It would have been incredibly lame to make such a declaration and then fail to finish it in one blow. Come to think of it, pulling rank, hey? While he didn't want to do such a thing to the members of Nazarick, he didn't particularly care about doing it to adventurers that he didn't even know. Suddenly, the faces of the dwarves and the bearer family floated in his mind. It's probably not good to use it on subcontractors, either. Oops. He had gotten lost in thoughts that weren't relevant to the current situation. Nabe. Thanks for keeping this one busy. I'll take over from here. Yes, Momon San. Common sense would dictate that he should attack the skeletal dragon immediately from the side rather than saying unnecessary things to Narbarrel. However, as he had been doing until now, he needed to demonstrate the composure expected of an adamantite-ranked adventurer. As Narbarrel attempted to fall back, the skeletal dragon tried to launch an attack. However, for Ainz, who had gained the physical prowess of a level 100 warrior through Perfect Warrior, the skeletal dragon might as well have been moving in slow motion. He stepped in and brought his sword down on its extended neck. Its head flew off easily, spinning through the air before falling to the ground. He heard exclamatory shouts of "Oh!" coming from the adventurers. Since there hadn't been such impressed cries when he defeated the first skeletal dragon, it seemed his declarations were indeed important. Ainz turned his gaze toward the final skeletal dragon, the one that Hamsuk should have been fighting. Hamsuk was pushing forward one-sidedly. The difference in raw power was obvious. Making sharp cracking sounds, Hamsuk was swinging her tail like a whip, dealing steady damage. Fine cracks webbed across the skeletal dragon's entire body, and it was on the verge of crumbling away. There was no need for Ainz to provide support. This won't even net any XP, gah. Ainz felt exasperated at himself for thinking such gamer-like thoughts about how many experience points would be earned based on the skeletal dragon's level and Hamsuk's presumed level. If leveling up worked like it did in-game, things would be so much more straightforward. While Ainz and the rest of Nazarick appeared to be bound by Yggdrasil's concept of levels, it was possible that the creatures of this world, such as Hamsuk and the lizardmen Zeryuza they had subjugated, weren't structured according to a level system at all. Well, I have a feeling they might be structured that way. The tier magic system, among other such things, is proof of that. That was why Ainz was conducting combat training experiments with the lizardmen he had subjugated. The fact that friendly fire was now permitted made power leveling possible. By having them defeat the pop undead that spawned in Nazarick and tracking the numbers they defeated, they could investigate whether experience point calculations held true. If there isn't any abnormal increase in ability in the sense of leveling up, rather than natural improvement in physical ability through training, it will be considered a failure. And if there's a level cap, it's all pointless anyway. But since those we've resurrected, like Zeryuzu, have reported their bodies moving poorly, there must be something similar to a level down caused by resurrection magic. From the experimental result that Hamsuk had become able to wear armor had acquired a warrior class, it seemed she might be receiving the benefits of the level system, but since Nazarick, an entity influenced by the game system, was involved, one could also argue that this involvement was what allowed her to level up. Really, it's all so confusing. While Ainz was considering various methods of strengthening Nazarick in the future, Hamsuk bashed the skeletal dragon's head off and gave Ainz a victory pose. Good work, Hamsuk. Haha, yes, that it is. The huge hamster came lumbering over on 2 legs. You're an animal, so run on all 4s. Ainz thought, but kept it to himself. Rather, he found himself thinking that it was quite impressive she could stand upright supporting her weight on just her 2 hind legs. He felt like he had been seeing that posture more frequently since Hamsuk acquired the warrior class. If she were to pursue a class like monk, would she be able to use kicking techniques with those legs? Then again, Hamsuk was a magical beast. She was probably capable of such things, unlike ordinary beasts. Now then, are you all over there all right? Ainz called out to the adventurers who were standing there. A man who appeared to be a warrior stepped forward. Their representative, most likely the team's leader. We are very grateful for your assistance. My apologies if I am mistaken, sir, but might you be Momonga of Darkness, the renowned adamantite-ranked adventurer? Contrary to his savage appearance, he spoke in a formal manner. Perhaps he just styled his outward appearance this way to maintain an adventurer persona, while inside he was an earnest young man. This was a common practice. Many adventurers used such camouflage to avoid being made light of by clients, business rivals, and fellow professionals. Dyeing their hair was another example. Ainz was quite familiar with such inner workings because of his frequent interactions with adventurers. Ah, it seems that you know of me. Yes, I am Momon. And over there is my companion, Nabe. And this is my mount, Hamsuk. I'm Hamsuk, that I am. Hamsuk quickly bowed her head, while Narbarrel merely inclined her head slightly without saying anything. It wasn't even at the level of a nod. She had barely moved her head at all, but Ainz felt deeply moved to see this, thinking, look how much she's grown. The Narbarrel of the past would certainly have responded more harshly. However, seeing how Hamsuk had properly greeted them, he couldn't help but feel that she still had a long way to go. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. I am Antwali. And these are Antwali proceeded to introduce his companions and explain how they had come to be here, while Ainz listened with what appeared to be a thoughtful attitude. Though it caught his attention slightly that they were workers rather than adventurers, there was nothing in their story that particularly prompted him to ask questions. When that was finished, it was his turn. I see. We came to these plains searching for a ship that sails across the land at the request of Albedo, Prime Minister of the Sorcerer Kingdom. Why mean the ghost ship of the Katze Plains? Uncle's heard that too, but ain't it just a rumor or a tall tale? The arcane magic caster Envario, if he recalled correctly, cut in from the side. Antwali shot him a glaring look. Hey now, don't speak so rudely to Momonga, the one who helped us. Please pay it no mind. Though there is a difference between workers and adventurers, aren't we somewhat comrades in the same line of work? Besides, in a place like this, why don't we set aside rank and position and speak casually? If Momonga says so, then we have no objections. Within Ainz's mind, Antwali earned 1 point for being an outstanding Salariman. He liked polite men. Oh, sorry about that. Uncle's not very good with matters of etiquette. So then, Talking Momonsan up on his offer. Does the Prime Minister of the Sorcerer Kingdom have any special info? Like where it appeared, or something? No, unfortunately, we received no special information from the Prime Minister at all. Most likely, she just wants to verify the rumor. This land is supposedly territory of the Sorcerer Kingdom, after all. Or perhaps she intends to make it known at home and abroad that they can use me, can order me around at their beck and call, even for something as trivial as investigating idle gossip. You know, Uncle shouldn't say this, but ain't it possible the Prime Minister's got some other goal? She might, but since she submitted a proper request, I have no choice but to accept it. As an adventurer. By the way, I'm not asking this to collect on the debt for assisting you, but since you came to this land before us, I'd like to ask. Have you seen or heard anything about such a ship that comes to mind? They shook their heads from side to side. Unfortunately, it seemed that this wouldn't play out like a game event where the people he had helped would possess special information that would let him easily reach his destination. I see. We're planning to head for the next tower, but what will you all do? The group exchanged glances. We should head back, Antwali said quietly. He wasn't speaking to Ainz, but rather seeking agreement from his companions. No objections. Yeah, it's better to play it safe. We don't know how far into the plains the ones we buried made it, but since it ended up in a situation where 3 skeletal dragons appeared at once, our previous knowledge might not be useful anymore. It is regrettable that we cannot continue on and put more undead to rest, but as Bunaz said, it can't be helped. We need to warn those in the free city of Vadis. After all, in a broader sense, those people there are yes, our comrades in destroying the undead. Their decision was convenient for Ainz. He had no intention of opposing it. Still, there was one thing he needed to confirm. I have researched this area, but I'm not very familiar with it. This is embarrassing to ask, but could you tell me? Are those skeletal dragons such a threat? Surely you could have defeated them given enough time? And yet, you choose to retreat. In truth, he wasn't sure whether they could have defeated them or not. This was because he hadn't been present at any scene that would allow him to judge their strength. However, he still asked such questions because he wanted to know their benchmark for strength. From that, he could work backward to determine their strength as well. I see. Thank you for evaluating us so highly. I do believe we could have defeated the skeletal dragons. However, skeletal dragons are undead that have only been reported to appear deep in the interior. Moreover, only a single one has been confirmed at a time. For there to be 3 of them is abnormal, to say the least. Those who fled here and were wiped out must have drawn them along, but considering they managed to escape here from flying undead, I don't think they could have ventured that deep inside. Antwali took a breath after his long explanation before continuing. Given these circumstances, perhaps something has caused major changes in the pattern of how undead manifest in this land. Therefore, we have judged that proceeding any further would be dangerous at present. I see, Ainz understood their thoughts well. Then, unfortunately, this is where we part ways. Let us see you off. Did I make a mistake in saying that? Ainz thought immediately after he spoke. That comment had slipped out due to his eagerness to secure this location and send them on their way. No one would be pleased to be hurried along like that. If his desire to say just get out of here, you're in the way had accidentally shown through, the hero Momon might be thought of as an arrogant and egotistical person who threw around his adamantite rank. There was no need to be particularly considerate of their feelings, but he needed to avoid damaging the hero Momon's reputation. Human relationships are tricky. The remnants of the Salaryman Suzuki Satoru within Ainz grumbled about this. Perhaps exceptional people could live while ignoring all such concerns, but these were important matters for Suzuki Satoru, who possessed emotional faculties below those of an average person. Taking little notice of Ainz's inner conflict, Antwali and his companions didn't seem to take offense. However, he couldn't simply trust that at face value. Just because a salesman was smiling didn't mean they were smiling on the inside. Even Ainz himself, though his skeletal face couldn't move often, wasn't smiling beneath his smile. It is as you say. It may be best to leave quickly. Oi! Antwali called out to his companions. Call out to those in the tower too, and prepare to leave at once. Their movements after that were swift. Within minutes, everyone had gathered in front of the broken tower with their belongings. Momonga. Thank you very much for this time. If Momonga had not come, perhaps some of us would have died. We shall never forget this debt. As Antwali said this, everyone bowed their heads in unison and said, "Thank you very much." It was such superb coordination that Ainz wondered if they had rehearsed or discussed it inside. "No, I am the one who is thankful, that I was able to be of help to you all." When Ainz replied like that, they smiled back at him. Ainz watched them from outside the tower until after they climbed over the wall and completely disappeared into the thin fog. Though he strained his ears, he could no longer hear their footsteps. He wondered if they had refrained from commenting on the fact that he had conducted the entire exchange without removing his helmet, while they had removed whatever headgear they had been wearing because he was their savior. Or perhaps they had felt dissatisfied but simply left it unvoiced. There was no point in worrying about questions that had no answers. Now then, first let us enter the tower and make various preparations. Speaking to Narbarol, who had remained silent at his side until now, Ainz decided to move on to the next phase of his plan. Chapter 4. Ainz entered the tower along with Narbarol and Hamsuk. The door was a bit small for Hamsuk's massive frame, but they managed to drag her in with brute force. After closing the door, Ainz surveyed the interior of the tower, now cramped thanks to Hamsuk's presence. He was unable to find any holes where light might leak in from outside. Even so, Ainz felt uneasy about whether they were truly alone. "From what I can see, there don't appear to be any holes where someone could peek in from outside. Narbarol, do you notice anything concerning? Hamsuk, can you smell or see anything unusual?" The two of them looked around. Though it took some time to check behind Hamsuk, they both reported finding nothing. "I see. Hamsuk. Keep watch on our surroundings. Just be careful not to be discovered by any undead in the area." "Understood, milord." Hamsuk cheerfully and with assistance from Ainz and Narbarol went outside. After exiting, perhaps feeling refreshed, she stood on her hind legs and rolled her shoulders, visible through the closing gap in the door. Suppressing the urge to comment, Ainz sat down in a wooden chair that had been left there. It was solidly built, able to support even the weight of full-plate armor. One could even call it ruggedly constructed. Though Ainz wanted to get going right away, it would be better to wait until the earlier group had moved further away. That was why he had not returned to his usual form, despite the absence of prying eyes, and remained in the guise of Momon. Narbarol, who had come quite close, asked in a hushed voice, "Momonsan, was that all right?" He didn't need to ask what she meant. He could pretty much guess what she wanted to say. Will those people accept Momonsan's words and obediently return to the city? Narbarol lowered her voice further. Would it not have been better to kill them and avoid future complications? If you command it, even now I could the positive impression that Momon might gain by helping them, and the possibility of an information leak by letting them go. I have concluded that choosing the former outweighs the risk of the latter. Even if information were to leak by letting them go, there would be no problem unless it was something definitive enough to expose Ainz == Momon. On the contrary, the spread of information that Momon had come here on a request from the Sorcerer Kingdom would reinforce his alibi, making it rather convenient. Besides, if he killed them now, he would be unable to make use of them in the future if he ever wished to. In that case, Momonsan, what shall we do going forward? Will you continue to let adventurers go if we encounter more? No, that is a different matter entirely. Nothing should be witnessed about what we shall do next. We will dispose of them. However, if any are allowed to escape, it will turn into a worst-case scenario. Make sure it is carried out thoroughly. We must prepare in such a way that absolutely none can escape. Understood? Understood. Good. Now then, as planned, we'll take a few hours of free time. Ainz said this as he lit a lamp, then took out a book and began to read. When those at the top took the initiative to rest, it made it easier for those below to take breaks as well. Since Narbarrel was present, the book he chose was far beyond his intellectual capabilities. As a result, he was unable to parse any of its contents, leaving it unclear whether he was actually reading the book or merely staring at it. As for Narbarrel, she stood silently and without a hint of movement, watching him. He knew it wasn't the case, but the word surveillance came to mind. However, Ainz felt neither confusion nor discomfort. He had grown used to this behavior from the regular maids. Nabe. No, Narbarrel. You may do as you please, you know? Come to think of it, do you have any hobbies? Hobbies, you ask? Narbarrel tilted her head slightly. When asked directly like this, there's nothing I could point to in particular, but if I had to say, perhaps chatting. Ainz concealed his surprise. He felt it would be somewhat rude to be surprised by someone's hobby. However, the image of a chatty Narbarrel was quite different from his impression of her. Who do you usually chat with? The other Pleiades, or the regular maids, or Cocytus-sama, I suppose. Is that so? Though he was a bit curious about what they discussed, Ainz quickly shut his mouth before he could ask. He suddenly remembered hearing from a colleague about how female employees would invariably gather to criticize their superiors. Of course, they surely wouldn't speak ill of Ainz, but what about Sebas and Pestonia? If, hypothetically though he wanted to think it impossible Narbarrel and the others were bad-mouthing those two. Having instantly recognized this topic as a minefield, Ainz tried to alter the course of the conversation. By the way, what sort of hobbies do the other Pleiades have? Let's see. Ainz-san Yuri does many things, but perhaps it would be sewing? Though I'm not entirely confident. Solution enjoys, though I hesitate to call that music, listening to music. I don't think she performs it herself. Shizu likes to collect cute things. Entima likes to eat tasty things. As for Lupus Regina, perhaps invading others' personal space. While two of them had somewhat concerning hobbies, by comparison, Narbarrel seemed quite respectable. I see. Well then, in that case, why don't you try chatting with me for a little bit? Ainz closed his book and turned to face Narbarrel, who became flustered. And no, I couldn't possibly do such a thing as intrude on Ainz-sama's precious time. I will go talk with Hamsuk outside. Is that so? Well then, that's fine too, if you prefer. Narbarrel fled outside. Ainz understood her feelings very well, nodding inwardly as he watched her retreating figure. He too would want to escape if his superior were to offer to spend their free time indulging in his hobbies. Hobbies were enjoyable precisely because you could do them freely without having to look to your superiors for approval. It would be hell if your hobby became a part of your job. Now alone, Ainz set aside the book in front of him and took out another. With Narbarrel gone, there was no need to read a difficult book. After finishing about 2 books, Ainz stood up. The time was ripe. When he opened the door, he found Hamsuk and Narbarrel sitting together on the ground, apparently gazing at the sky. Shrouded in thin fog and white with haze, the sky didn't seem particularly enjoyable to observe, but perhaps they found something meaningful in it. However, Ainz only glimpsed this for an instant, as they both immediately turned around at the sound of the opening door. Nabe. Momonga. He didn't point out how mixed up she was getting. Ainz pretended not to notice and asked, has anyone appeared in the area since that earlier group departed? No, there hasn't been anyone. Once, I sent out a summoned monster to patrol the area, but there seemed to be nothing there. That's right, it is. To my ears and nose, there weren't any signs of living beings at all, that there wasn't. I see. If you two say so, then there shouldn't be any problems. Now then, let's begin. After returning alone into the tower, Ainz dispelled his armor and transformed from Momonga back into Ainz. The first spell he cast was Gate. The destination was the surface part of the great underground tomb of Nazarick. The undead who had been waiting on the other side emerged from the gate in a line. They were elder liches. Moreover, ones that Ainz had created. They were 10 in number, assembled in a line before Ainz and making the interior of the small tower quite cramped. Perhaps it would have been more efficient to use more powerful undead. However, there were several advantages to using elder liches. For example, since Ainz could create them, their destruction wouldn't be a significant loss. 2. As undead, they would not be attacked by the mindless undead of this land. It was also unlikely that they would be attacked by intelligent undead. 3. Even if some unknown being had made this area their lair, elder liches were said to appear naturally in this land, so they wouldn't seem too out of place. They would be thought of as naturally occurring elder liches rather than ones from the sorcerer kingdom. 4. They could use fly, making movement easy. 5. Being generally considered strong in this world, they were capable of combat to a certain extent and could serve reasonably well as bait for unknown third parties. And so on. The third point was particularly excellent. If he brought powerful undead ones that shouldn't exist in the Katze plains from Nazarick, it might put any powerful beings in the area on guard. Given the choice between being viewed warily or being underestimated, Ainz preferred the latter. Ainz created armor and other equipment with his magic, returning to his guise of Momonga. Next, he took out a staff shaped like a skull seated atop a spinal column. It was a staff purportedly borrowed from the sorcerer king Ainz Ooal gown, to be used to control the undead, the elder liches. Though it contained a data crystal and thus held mana, in reality it possessed no such ability. While it might raise suspicions under close examination, if it reached the point of being stolen and examined, the situation would likely be dire enough that such concerns would be irrelevant. Therefore, he hadn't worried about that possibility. Having completed these preparations, he finally opened the door and stepped outside. The elder liches followed behind him. He dramatically pointed the staff he held at the lined-up elder liches. For now, state your numbers. Following Ainz's command, the elder liches began to state their numbers. These were not names, but rather individual identification numbers that could be considered as such. Ainz wrote all of them down on a memo pad. A more capable person might be able to memorize them, but Ainz could not. Okay, got it. Once every few hours, I will contact each of you with message. Report what you have found at that time. You need not concern yourselves with ordinary undead, but special undead or structures should be reported. He knew that there were major gaps in these instructions. For instance, if they discovered a zombie wearing armor, would it count as a special undead? The answer was no. In this land, where adventurers and soldiers often ended up as zombies, armored zombies were neither rare nor remarkable. But what about in Yggdrasil? The ordinary zombie pop monsters had graphics showing them in tattered clothes. If Ainz was told about an ordinary zombie, the first thing that would come to mind was the familiar Yggdrasil zombie. Monsters created by Ainz were born with some understanding of his intentions and circumstances, but the concepts they shared were on the level of what could be thought of as common sense. However, he couldn't be certain whether they would consider an armored zombie unremarkable. Or what if, although extremely unlikely, a zombie in this land was wearing armor made in Yggdrasil? Thus, it was impossible to draw clear lines about what constituted special. One might suggest thoroughly examining every undead that appeared to avoid such issues, but examining each zombie individually would take an unimaginable amount of time. Even these elder liches, the fact that Ainz had created them aside, were the forces of Nazarick. Using them in such an inefficient manner was out of the question. From a cost-benefit perspective, it would be better to start with fuzzy orders and increase precision if the desired results weren't achieved. Now, one at a time, starting from the lowest numbered, come take the items I will hand you. Pointing the staff at them for each command was tedious, but it was necessary to establish an alibi. He had to endure it. Ainz handed over each of the different items he had prepared to the elder liches. He made sure to note down which had received what item. Notes were crucial. Especially when his head felt this stuffed to the brim. If we're going to conduct operations like this frequently, I should probably take photos of the items we use, but then I'd have to take pictures from every angle, so there'd be a lot. I wonder if it would be worth the resources consumed. While grumbling internally, Ainz desperately tried to memorize the appearance of the items he had distributed, then let out a sigh. His already limited memory capacity was packed full of information, and he felt that if he tried to remember anything more, it would push something else out like Tokoroten 3. No, even just sighing though Ainz didn't breathe, he couldn't help but feel like something was going to leak out. At any rate, this concluded the preparations. Well, I have a spell sealing crystal after all, so if anything were to happen I should at least be able to cover it up. Following Ainz's brief command of go, the elder liches cast fly and rose into the sky, each scattering in the direction they were instructed. As Ainz watched the elder liches until they disappeared into the fog, Narbarel approached him timidly, showing an attitude quite unlike her usual self. Ah, wait a moment. Ainz raised his hand casually and answered magnanimously, gesturing with a tilt of his head toward the tower entrance. Though Narbarel alone would have been sufficient, for some reason Hamsuk followed along as well. With the help of Ainz and Narbarel, Hamsuk entered and deftly closed the door. Now then, with this we can afford to be a bit less vigilant about being observed. What is it? Did something happen? Oh, yes. I don't mean to question Insama's judgment, but no, certainly not. I don't mean to I am confident that the undead that Insama created won't fail in this task, but considering Insama's conclusion that there might be an unknown enemy in this land, it seems somewhat might be too presumptuous, but Narbarel stammered nervously. Though the finer details were somewhat unclear, she probably meant that the elder liches were insufficient in terms of combat strength. Her inability to ask this directly stemmed from the fact that the elder liches summoned earlier had been created by Ainz himself. Had they been the pop elder liches that spawned naturally within Nazarick, she would have been able to ask him in her usual manner of speech. So in the end, is the status of the undead I create still a delicate matter? Ainz had already made an official statement. The undead he created were inferior to the NPCs. However, Narbarel seemed 3. Tokoroten is a noodle dish made by pressing a solid block of seaweed jelly through an extruding device called a tentsuki, shredding it into thin strips. To be one of those who couldn't simply accept that with a yes, I understand. Being told let's drop the formalities but being unable to act on it even after saying yes, I understand, truly a well-conditioned working adult. While mentally awarding Narbarel 1 working adult point and feeling a sense of kinship, Ainz explained the advantages he had considered earlier. Narbarel listened silently before letting out a deep sigh of admiration. As expected of Insama. Have you already considered everything I thought of? Yes. This is an extremely rare case where I carefully thought through my options and chose the elder liches. Well, if this were Albedo or Demiurge, given their brilliance, they might have thought of different undead or methods, but this is the best I can do, I suppose. Narbarel showed a somewhat troubled smile. This too, he sort of understood. Ainz was being honest about his rare moment of careful consideration, but for the NPCs who for some reason believed him to be wise, it probably came across as sarcasm or a poor joke. Oh. Am I being sharp today? Usually, I wouldn't be able to read this far into things. Could it be that some special magical effect in this land is accelerating my undead brain's processing speed? The fact that I'm even thinking this probably means that's not the case. No, I was being serious, but, well, you see, Narbarel. It's wonderful that you're considering potential holes in the plan and trying to make suggestions, isn't that the proper attitude to have? This was absolutely something that needed to be said. In fact, he had said it many times before. It would be very problematic if she concluded since Insama has already thought so far ahead, I shouldn't ask any strange questions. That was why he needed to praise Narberl and encourage her to continue asking questions in similar scenarios in the future. Because next time, she would surely point out something he had overlooked. Not blindly following the ideas of your superior, but thinking things through yourself and asking questions when something is unclear or questionable. That attitude is wonderful and, as a leader, exactly what I wanted to see. Just now, Narberl, you were amazing. Ainz's vocabulary was sorely lacking. He should have used more sophisticated words of praise, but none had come to mind. Amazing, you say? Amazing. Absolutely amazing. It was pure momentum. Or rather, momentum was all he had. You are amazing. Narberl is amazing. You are so amazing. You are amazing, Narberl. Ainz-sama, please stop, Narberl spoke in a small voice, her face bright red as she looked down. Is that so? Why, yes, they both fell silent. Was I a little too persistent? Ainz regretted his actions, wondering if he had gone too far. He hadn't meant to be sarcastic or embarrass Narberl, but it would be bad if she had taken it that way. It was a difficult thing, to praise a subordinate as their superior. How did typical managers praise their subordinates? He wanted to use that for reference. I've read books about how to be a good boss, but there weren't any books that listed specific words to use when praising your subordinates, or maybe I just haven't come across one yet. Was there any value in reading business books that weren't specific? No, perhaps he was at fault for not picking up what he needed from them. While Ainz pondered vaguely, the atmosphere remained unchanged. Frankly speaking, the mood inside the tower was unbearable. Incidentally, he ignored Hamsuk, who was fidgeting next to him as if wanting to ask, "And me? What about me?" Normally, this would be the time to make use of Hamsuk. If he threw out some casual topic, Hamsuk would eagerly jump in, Narberl would then respond to Hamsuk in her usual unrestrained manner, and things would return to normal. However, since they had come to this land, Hamsuk would mutter to herself more than usual whenever she was left alone for a bit, making it somewhat scary to engage her in conversation. Perhaps she is talking to something that can't be seen, though there don't seem to be any invisible undead around. In that case, is she just lonely? I should fulfill my duties as a responsible pet owner. He might need to play ball with her or something when they return to Nazarick. Oh, crap. Narberl is still feeling uncomfortable. Here, though it's a bit forced to him. Sorry. I've just remembered there is another task that I must handle. Narberl, I apologize, but could you keep watch outside? That goes for you too, Hamsuk. Why yes, at once. Narberl's response was unusually enthusiastic. She moved with more than her usual swiftness to exit the tower, accepting his sudden excuse without suspicion. Normally she would have given Hamsuk a cold look and forcibly dragged her along, but this time she left her behind. Well then, milord. I shall also keep watch outside with Narberl. No, that I shall. I'm counting on you, Hamsuk. After the two of them left, Ainz now alone waited inside the tower for a while. This was because he needed to wait for the elder liches to spread out and they hadn't stopped moving. However, considering the scale of the Katze plains, it was quite difficult to tell whether they had stopped or were still on the move. All he could do was wait quietly. He would have preferred to pass the time reading, but he couldn't help but feel that doing so would make the appearances of all the items he had so carefully memorized slip from his mind. Therefore, he could only endure this ordeal in silence. How many hours had passed? Though he couldn't see through the fog, the sun had probably set by now. He felt he had done something unkind to those two he'd left waiting outside all this time. There was no point in having them wait outside at the moment. It might have been better to let them wait inside. Then again, if they had been inside, he might have lost his concentration. Ainz focused on the elder liches he had sent out. More precisely, he tried to sense his own undead that were in the area. Unlike near Iruntal, there were only a few of his undead in the vicinity, so he could somewhat sense their general locations. They had dispersed far and wide. Though it was still insufficient considering the total size of the Katze plains, they had moved far enough that he could now send a message to check on their current status. Ainz cast the spell to contact them one by one. Most reported finding nothing special, but one elder lich had discovered something unusual. "Insama, I have discovered a crab." "A crab?" Hearing those words brought an image of a bright red crab to Ainz's mind. He had never eaten one before, the only crab he had ever tried was imitation crab stick, but he at least knew that much. In addition, there were also crab-shaped monsters in Yggdrasil. "Are you near a lake?" "No, or perhaps the sea." "Is there a beach?" "No, I apologize. It is a plain." He wasn't sure what the apology was for, but the situation of a crab being on a plain was far more pressing. Perhaps Ainz simply didn't know enough about crab ecosystems. Maybe this was normal? However, while he remembered them appearing in locations associated with water in Yggdrasil like swamps and seas, he couldn't recall them appearing on dry land. Ainz shook his head internally. Crab was just the elder lich's recognition. There was no guarantee that it was truly a crab. Skeletal dragons were a good example. Though they bore the name of dragon, they merely resembled one in form and weren't created from dragon bones as one might expect. But still, why an undead crab? No, it must be an undead or monster that just resembles a crab in form. Wait a moment. Ainz looked at his memo pad, desperately trying to remember the shape of the item he had given to that elder lich. It seemed his memory was correct, as the scene was reflected in the mirror of remote viewing. Looking down at the scene from above, beneath the elder lich flying overhead was a crab. He involuntarily dropped his act at the sight of the creature below. A crab. He blinked several times. Still, it didn't seem to be an illusion, and the figure didn't vanish or change. The mirror showed the image of a crab that Ainz knew, though one of substantial size. It was considerably larger than a human. Perhaps it was even larger than Hamsuk. It supported and lifted its massive body on spindly legs. There were no visible alterations to its form, like the physical deterioration typical of zombies, but Ainz's veteran undead instincts told him that this crab was undead. Ainz slowly closed his eyes and reopened them. Sure enough, it hadn't disappeared. If this were a summoned monster, he could understand. But why was a sea creature here, so far inland? Ainz shook his head. He had heard stories that crabs could live in rivers too. Not in the stagnant, heavy metal-laden rivers that Ainz knew, but in the clean, clear rivers of the past. Could there be a river flowing nearby that this crab had wandered away from? As Ainz pondered this, the crab began to walk slowly. It trudged forward steadily. What am I thinking? I guess my feelings are in disarray after seeing an undead, probably an undead, that exceeded my expectations. But, what should I do? I somewhat want it. Since his emotions weren't forcibly dampened, the shock must not have been too severe. Indeed, just seeing a crab shouldn't be that shocking. If he was shaken by just that, his mental fortitude would seem a bit weak. In any case, with the shock subsiding, his collector's desire for rare specimens began to rise within him. Now that I think of it, does it seem to be intelligent? In that case, I will try calling out to it. The crab stopped, and then started moving again. Though it seemed to have noticed the elder lich hovering above, it showed no sign of wanting to do anything about it. Either it was mindless and simply didn't recognize its fellow undead as an enemy, or it was intelligent but reserved its hatred for the living rather than the undead. It was troublesome that both possibilities seemed plausible. It was rare, so he wanted to keep it, but when considering the pros and cons, it was a difficult decision. To control mindless undead, one needed to use abilities like undead domination. Unlike humans who could be swayed with the candy, or beasts who could be trained with the whip, that kind of approach wouldn't work here. While it might be fine just to let it roam free to repel intruders, as the one who held the territory, Ainz found uncontrolled mindless undead rather inconvenient. For the time being, follow that crab. Look for any rivers, seas, or lakes. After giving these instructions, Ainz ended the message. If there turned out to be no rivers, seas, or lakes, then where had this undead appeared from? Certainly, in a world with magic, common sense from his original world couldn't be relied upon. However, well, I suppose there's nothing odd about a crab that travels on land. No, come to think of it, such creatures probably exist normally. Such a crab had probably wandered into this land, died, and become an undead. Looking at it that way, everything made sense. And yet a crab. Could there have once been a lake here that dried up? Did this fog originate from that lake water? Then perhaps, the ghost ship. After that, he used message several more times to gather information. As Ainz's memory capacity was starting to fade, he finally heard the words he had been hoping for. In Sama, I have discovered the land sailing ship that we sought. He should have been excited to hear those words. Yet somehow, his joy was minimal. Perhaps his emotional suppression as one of the undead was at work. Rather than expressing joy, Ainz voiced the first doubt that came to mind. Well, how should I put this? Before I praise you for discovering our objective, let me ask a trivial question. This truly is a trivial question. I understand it would be faster to just see it with my own eyes, but... No, yes, all right. I'm going to ask now. Its shape, it wouldn't happen to be something like a ship that floats on water, would it? That is correct. I see. I don't even know anymore. Black diamond, black diamond, black diamond. I was prepared for this. I was prepared from the moment I heard the words. That is correct. However, while it was described as flying through the air, it can certainly be said that it's a floating ship, so the rumor wasn't false, but still, having teleport directly from the tower supposedly by Nabe's magic, Ainz looked with mixed feelings at the ship the Elder Lich had discovered, sailing over land. It was truly a ghost ship. Everything about it was completely dilapidated. Large holes had opened in the hull, and in many places the planks were peeling away. Though it was very large, its decrepit state made it look to Ainz like a mass of scrap materials advancing along. If this were placed in the sea, it would surely sink vigorously the next instant. It had 3 masts, and the sails that hung on them were also in tatters. The ram bow that seemed to have been attached at a later time appeared somewhat rounded at the tip. Was it not originally intended for ramming attacks, or had Ainz simply been wrong in imagining it should be sharp, and it was correct for it to be somewhat rounded? Personally, he thought a pointy tip would look cooler. The ship's speed wasn't very fast. Extended oars churned the fog as it floated about a meter above the ground, moving sluggishly forward. As expected, even when he saw it directly there were no signs of any illusion at work. It was rather disappointing. He had been hoping for something cool and otherworldly, an imposing ship that flew like it cut through the sky, something with which even Ainz was unfamiliar. He had sought something unknown that could only be called a ship due to its shape and size for convenience's sake. However, its true identity was just a derelict vessel, which deflated his budding excitement. People tended to find unexpected developments surprising and interesting. But when something was too absurd, they would suddenly lose interest with a "Hey! Why did it turn out like that?" In other words, it became too incomprehensible for them to maintain interest. By Ainz's sensibilities, the rumor of a land-sailing ship had been right in the sweet spot that stimulated curiosity, but its true identity being a slightly floating ghost ship fell perfectly into the disappointing zone. It felt like watching a movie that built up expectations with its setup only to have an utterly predictable ending. Is this ship undead or not? I can't tell with this fog in the way. Is it a magical item? Or perhaps a golem? Or is it just a somewhat unusual wreck? No, fundamentally, how is it even floating? Yggdrasil had ghost ships as well, but those battered wrecks floated on the sea's surface due to the ability of a boss enemy and would sink immediately when it was defeated. If this was a similar situation, he couldn't afford to kill the boss enemy. Conversely, if the ship's owner was undead, and if he could bring them under his control, he might be able to acquire the ship as is. If the reason this ship floats is because of the ability of some boss enemy-like entity, wouldn't it be better to just put them on a new ship and have them use their ability? Irantal was inland and unfortunately had no large ships, but he could have one made in the Empire and purchase it from them. Now was probably a good enough time. Dropping his guise of Mammon, he returned to being Ainz and sent Hamsuk back through a gate. As a precaution, he had positioned elder liches around the tower, so Hamsuk's safety should be ensured for the time being. But, in Sama, as I asked earlier, is it alright to take on that form? Yes. Since it turned out to be merely a well, it seems odd to say merely, but anyway, since it turned out to be merely a ghost ship, there is unlikely to be anyone monitoring what happens from here on out. Besides, assuming the ship has a crew, it would be foolish to reveal the connection between Mammon and Ainz by dispelling the magic partway through. Mammon and Hamsuk are standing by in the tower. Nabe is, in a sense, a hostage. That should be enough of an explanation. Those were his reasons for dispelling his disguise as Mammon. And there was one more reason. It would be far too careless to act as Mammon unable to use magic against an opponent of unknown combat ability. It might have been fine if he was alone, but Narbarol was here. While Hamsuk could be abandoned if worse came to worst, he wanted to avoid sacrificing Narbarol. Even if he had to abandon her, when he did so he would want to have the excuse that he had done his best but failed. He could have returned to Nazarick and brought back Pandora's actor disguised as Mammon, but he couldn't see enough merit to justify that effort. Come to think of it, I've never tried negotiating with wild undead, or should I call them that? Undead that spawned naturally in this world. It would be nice if there was some kind of affection meter bonus when talking with fellow undead, but I somehow doubt it. Ainz glared at the target ship. How should he attack? To what extent should he enhance himself with magic? Since he didn't know how it was floating, he should avoid sinking the ship attacks that would render it unable to sail. In other words, attacks that would damage the ship or area of effect attacks were out of the question. But more of a problem than anything else was how to capture the ship. If it were just an ordinary ship, the best approach would be to threaten the crew and take control, but if undead were operating it, that could be quite difficult. This was because low-rank mindless undead like skeletons or such could not be negotiated with or threatened. Even with intelligent undead, fear and other effects were not effective, so it would be necessary to explain the benefits. Of course, the promise of not being destroyed could be benefit enough, but still. Now then, Nabe. Let's board the ship and gather more information. Understood. Though they probably weren't being monitored, so calling her Narbarol should be fine, he figured it would be better to use Nabe while she was still in that outfit. The two of them cast fly to approach the ship. First, they would check from above. From above, it truly looked like nothing but a ghost ship. There was no sign of the crew on deck. Where was the helmsman? There were cabin-like structures raised at both the fore and aft of the deck, but was one of these the wheelhouse? Then skeletons emerged in quick succession from the bow structure, moving swiftly. They wore no armor and held crossbows in their hands. Moving more nimbly than ordinary skeletons, they formed ranks and aimed their crossbows at Ainz and Narbarol. No, not at Ainz, the undead. Their target was probably Narbarol, the living. Nabe. I won't allow any objections. Use me as a shield. Bolts were fired from the crossbows. Their aim was quite accurate. Only 2 bolts missed. The rest were turned away just before hitting Ainz's body. So that means they're not magical weapons? Ainz was equipped with a magical item that provided complete protection against non-magical projectiles. Due to this effect, they were unable to harm his body. Of course, even if they were magical bolts, Ainz's complete resistance to piercing damage meant that he wouldn't be injured. The skeletons readied for a second volley. No matter how many bolts they fired, there was nothing to fear. Now then, what to do? The skeletons probably came out after Narbaral's presence was detected, but the question remains. Who detected Narbaral? No figures other than skeletons were visible on the ship. The commander is hiding away and using the skeletons as sacrificial pawns to gauge our strength? Is that a reasonable conclusion? Well, that's fine. He would show them a fraction of his combat capabilities. The second volley flew at Ainz, and again the bolts were deflected just before impact. This volley was in no way no different from the first. If they want to analyze our strength, they should try using different bolts from the previous volley. Do they not have any? Or perhaps they can't issue such detailed instructions. Nape, we're landing on the deck. Though they seemed stronger than ordinary skeletons, the difference was negligible. While the skeletons were preparing their third volley, Ainz, already gripping a crude staff, descended to the center of the ship. The ghost ship's deck, though free of holes, was still quite dilapidated. It creaked loudly as it received the weight of Ainz's body. There was no sound from Narbaral, who must have descended directly behind him not because she was so light, but because she was still maintaining fly and hovering slightly. Whatever the case, the deck showed no signs of giving way under Ainz's weight. One might evaluate it as being sturdier than it looked, but Ainz could tell that this was not the case. Ainz was able to detect the undead, but until now the fog had been interfering with that ability. However, as expected, at this distance it was because he was in contact with it that he could tell clearly. This ship was undead. I see. This is the one that detected Narbaral. Yes. This ship itself was a single undead. The relationship between the skeletons and this ship, whether coexistent, parasitic, or subordinate, was still unclear. However, maybe I don't have to suspect that someone is trying to uncover Momonga's true identity. It's probably just an undead that happens to exist in a land full of the undead. Surely I don't need to consider this some kind of trap set up over 10 or more years before we came to this world. However, the question of why it's a ghost ship still remains. The matter of the skeletal dragons was also somewhat concerning, but there was too little information about that at present. At any rate, if this is such a huge undead, how high would its level be? No, it might just be the case that it has absurdly high HP but is otherwise mediocre. As evidenced by overlords like Ainz, size didn't directly correlate to level. Still, it was also true that large monsters were usually high level. And had high HP as well. The skeletons aimed their crossbows at Ainz and Narbaral. Nabe. At that single word, Narbaral hid behind Ainz. Then came the third volley. The same thing happened as before. No, having come closer, not a single bolt missed this time, but the result was the same. The skeletons began to load bolts into their crossbows yet again. Their actions showed a remarkable lack of intelligence. The second volley was still understandable. Since they had been hovering in the air, the skeletons had no other way to attack. Moreover, repeating the same method of attack in a short period could have been a valid strategy, were they to assume the ability that nullified their projectiles had a limited number of uses. However, at this distance, they should throw away their ineffective crossbows and attack with their fists. Does this mean their orders haven't changed? Are they under the control of this ship? If these skeletons were the subordinates of someone monitoring the situation, they wouldn't act this way. Therefore, he should assume it was someone who couldn't observe the situation. In that case, it will only switch attacks once the skeletons take damage, right? The ship was still moving when the skeletons came out on deck. The oars were moving too, if I'm not mistaken. Then, there's no problem. Ainz stepped forward and swung the staff in his hand. The staff that Ainz held was indeed specialized for melee combat, but more importantly, his opponents were mere skeletons. Fragile as they were, they shattered noisily each time the staff struck. The skeletons were clearly aiming their crossbows at Ainz, but he ignored them. Just like before, the bolts were deflected. In the end, the skeletons only stopped shooting when Ainz shattered the last one. What's the matter? Yes, Wobbs. With a loud bang, a door opened. When they looked, an undead figure emerged from the structure at the stern of the ship. In one hand it waved a drawn scimitar. Perched atop its head was a tricorn hat. What's more, it was garbed in a plain heavy coat and trousers. At a glance, it was the outfit of a pirate captain, but what filled it was a familiar type of undead. An elder lich. However, ordinary elder liches were magic casters. Considering its attire, the elder lich before them seemed more like a lightly equipped warrior. Even judging by equipment alone, it was most definitely a rare specimen. "Ye cunts! What have ye done to me wife's crew?" the elder lich bellowed, seeing the broken remains of the skeletons scattered across the deck. It was true that it was angry, but as an undead, its emotions couldn't have been so heightened as to be called furious. "You!" The elder lich's gaze had been fixed on Narberl from the start. It had completely ignored Ainz, who had destroyed the skeletons. The reason became clear with its next words. "Be one o' the livin', an' cha. Just lookin' at that face, just feelin' yer presence what be this sensation boilin' up inside? Do this be what they calls hatred?" Perhaps this was the first emotion this elder lich had ever experienced. If it had never left this land before, this was entirely possible. Ainz found himself unsure how to respond. Would there be any benefit in destroying this undead? Moreover, what was the nature of the relationship between this ghost ship and the elder lich before him? Common sense would suggest that it was the captain and helmsman, but since the ship itself was undead, there was the possibility that it could move autonomously. And there's also the existence of this wife. Does she specialize in dominating the undead? Is that why they haven't commenced their attack? Ainz and Narberl had designated themselves as enemies by destroying the skeletons, and yet the elder lich still chose to talk. This might be a delaying tactic until some preparation was complete. Even assuming this wife is at the same level, or even slightly higher, I can't imagine she could pose a threat to Narberl and myself. In that case, I should think it's more beneficial to play along with their stalling for time. "Are you the undead steering this ship?" "No, are you the ship's captain?" The elder lich shifted its gaze as if registering Ainz's presence for the first time. He could tell that its attention was now directed at him. Then, it stopped. "Hoh! Inside. Quite clever. First initiating conversation, then maintaining silence. Indeed, perfect for buying time. For a low-ranking undead to ignore Insama's question. Such insolence is beyond measure. Nabe. Be quiet." "Yes. My apologies." Ainz could sense Narberl bowing behind him. At the same time, the undead tentatively labeled as the ship's captain began to tremble violently. Was it able to recognize my strength with just a glance? Perhaps it's using some kind of detection magic? Well done. However, this works in my favor. Now I can negotiate various what the hell. What a handsome mug. Hey! Ainz doubted his ears. "Yeah bastard. Actin' all high and mighty just 'cause you're a little better lookin' than me. I'll destroy yet. I'll keelhaul yet. What is this?" At these words expressing jealousy of his good looks, for which no one unrelated to Nazarick had ever complimented him on before, Ainz despite being undead was momentarily confused. This wasn't an act or provocation. The elder lich was serious. And it seemed to be genuinely angry. While Ainz understood that the sense of beauty varied from person to person, being praised by someone with a different aesthetic sense made him feel more suspicious than embarrassed. What Ainz felt was beyond that. It was a feeling that made him call into question the other party's sanity. Fireball. The spell was fired off. Is that scimitar it's holding just for show? Based on its choice of attack, maybe it is just a regular elder lich after all. Perhaps it only looked rare because of its unusual equipment? These and various other thoughts crossed Ainz's mind. The fireball swelled viciously, but there was no way a third-tier spell could damage Ainz. It wouldn't be much of a problem for Narberl either. Still, the fact that Narberl might have taken some damage was more than enough for him to take offense. However, he held such emotions firmly in check. "I can't believe you would use fireball on a ship." Ainz spoke haughtily. On top of it being a wooden ship, it was also an undead, so it was highly likely that fire damage was a weakness. Taking this into consideration, it should have chosen a different spell, but the fact that it didn't might mean this elder lich wasn't actually in a cooperative relationship with the ship's undead. Whatever the circumstances, the undead ship captain should not forget itself in anger. If it had, then it would be fine to destroy it without hesitation. If it's a situation where destroying one means the other will be destroyed too, then I can't attack. Hey! Ainz had traveled here to procure the ghost ship. The ship came first in terms of relative priority. The undead ship captain came second. While Ainz was muttering to himself, the undead ship captain didn't follow up with another attack. Perhaps it had regained its composure after seeing an enemy who remained unfazed by a fire element attack, which should have been a weakness for most undead. Or perhaps it sensed something unknowable about its opponent. While carefully scrutinizing Ainz and Narbarrel, the undead ship captain opened his mouth once more, as if trying to draw information from them. "Ha! Me wife's immune to flame. Ya think she'd be harmed by this grade O attack?" Ainz was bewildered by the response, which was delivered in a slightly louder voice and carried a hint of mockery. There was only one thing he didn't understand about what was said. Wife. For a moment, he couldn't comprehend what it meant, but then he quickly realized that it must be referring to the ship. Ooh, it might be something like that, after all. Like giving a woman's name to a weapon or item. Is this the same type of thing? At that moment, Ainz heard the faint sound of bones rattling beneath his feet under the deck. "I see. As expected of an undead. It's quite calculating. Is that why it's shouting? Pretending to be angry and raising its voice to draw attention to itself while masking the sound of reinforcements arriving? In that case, the comment about my handsome face was. I guess it judged that it would serve as a convenient, or perhaps typical reason to launch an attack. What's th matter? Are ye stuck speechless at me wife's beauty? I'm not sure what kind of strategy it's planning, but, my first move should be this." It was unclear whether the ghost ship wasn't participating in combat because it was waiting for them to let their guard down, it couldn't attack without orders, or it couldn't fight while being boarded. But in any case, it wouldn't be a good idea to leave it unchecked. Ainz directed his undead domination ability at the ship. While he didn't have much capacity to spare, he was able to bring it under his control without issue. So its level probably wasn't that high after all. Joy welled up inside Ainz at obtaining a rare undead. Suddenly, the undead ship captain let out a groan. Before Ainz could consider the reason, it shrieked the answer. I've been cooked. It was an anguished wail of heartbreak. Undead, like Ainz, were supposed to have their excessive emotions suppressed. However, from its voice, it seemed to have transcended that limitation. No, even Ainz experienced extremely strong emotions just before they were suppressed, though only for a fleeting moment. Perhaps this was the same thing? This be too cruel. To be cooked by an undead that don't even have any skin. Its intense emotional outburst showed no signs of abating. No, even Ainz, I've been cooked. Cooked, just shut up already. Ainz raged internally. Besides, what's with calling it cuckoldry? How rude. Why am I being treated like some wife-stealer? That goes without saying. Narbarrel stepped forward 2 paces, taking up position in front of Ainz as if she were his herald. Ainz found himself staring at her dignified figure from behind, and then, comprehending what she had just said, he stared at her once more. She had agreed. Narbarrel had affirmed that Ainz had cuckolded this undead. Hey! It was unthinkable. The undead ship captain couldn't know about Ainz's abilities. Maybe giving it about 10,000 steps of leeway such a misunderstanding was possible. However, Narbarrel was different. In other words, she couldn't have misunderstood. Therefore Ainz had absolutely no idea what Narbarol was thinking. All undead belong to Insama. This is especially true for rare undead. It is only natural. Are ye saying it be natural to be QD? The undead ship captain cried out like it was spitting up blood. At this point, it was displaying emotions just like a human would. In response, Narbarol proudly declared, "Of course it is." To Ainz, the exchange playing out before him felt distant, as if he were watching a spectacle from far away. However, he wasn't allowed to remain a third-party observer for long. "Isn't that right, Insama?" Narbarol turned around, seeking his agreement with eyes that seemed somehow especially sparkly, though that might have just been Ainz's imagination. He didn't want to agree. But was this something he needed to affirm as part of his duties as the ruler of Nazarick? If he didn't agree, how would Narbarol feel, looking at him with those eyes full of trust and expectation? His thoughts swirled around in a whirlpool. The conflicted Ainz gasped out an answer. Saying all undead is going too far. Shalltear, Nigradu, Yuri, it sounds like you're saying that even those people belong to me. Oh. Narbarol's eyes went wide. I see. You may be right. I had forgotten about them. Let me correct myself. No, there's no need for corrections. But Ainz's silent plea went unheeded as Narbarol declared in a grand voice, all miscellaneous undead not created by the supreme beings belong to Insama. You were merely borrowing the leftovers. And not content with just cookin' me, now you're saying that I's be the home wrecker. I's be a home wrecker, yes says. Ye thinks that you suits her better. Enough already. Shut up about cuckoldry and home wreckers. Ainz shouted, abandoning his composure. You've completely ruined all my excitement about finding a rare undead. Fireball. Ainz and Narbarol were instantly enveloped in flames. Die. Ye Homir. Honestly, Ainz had wondered if the nonsensical comments about cuckoldry and home wreckers were meant to catch them off guard, a deception to gain the upper hand by chipping away at their tension and fighting spirit. But the words the Elder Lich had started to say suggested otherwise. Still, perhaps wary after seeing Ainz's group emerge unscathed once again, it closed its mouth mid-sentence. You should have realized that this cute little spell of yours doesn't do much damage earlier, no? And yet you chose the same attack again. Shall I take this as proof of your incompetence? He sneered. Of course, it was an act. He was merely acting out the arrogance of an overwhelmingly strong being. He wasn't seriously mocking the undead. The Elder Lich didn't seem rare in and of itself, but Ainz had an interest in the undead as the ship's captain. Plus, he had yet to procure an Elder Lich that was born in this world. That being the case, he wanted to bring it under his control if possible. But unlike with the ghost ship earlier, he couldn't just use his ability to dominate undead. Even for Ainz, who specialized in necromancy, there was a limit to the number of undead he could control. Since he still had undead under his control from the old days, he didn't have much capacity to spare. He didn't want to waste his undead domination ability on controlling a mere Elder Lich, even if it was somewhat rare. For that reason, he needed to make it recognize that it was facing an absolutely unbeatable opponent. While there might be ways to make him submit by offering benefits, that would be quite difficult given the current situation of being treated as an affair partner probably. So, he would make it understand through force. Or rather, he wanted to change the atmosphere. Damned home wrecker. Ye be strong. Just give it up, for now, could you please stop with the whole home wrecker shtick? It's draining my energy. My motivation is slipping away. If that was your aim, I praise you for succeeding, so please stop. From the perspective that nearly all undead belong to Insama, it is you who would be the home wrecker. Narbarol. Damn yet. Ye bastard. It was a voice filled with tremendous resentment. The hatred in those eyes was so intense that one might expect tears of blood to start flowing. But there was no sign that anything special was happening to Ainz's body or that something was being resisted by one of his abilities, so it didn't seem like it was casting any curses. In Ainz's mind, the meaning of rare was shifting from an elder lich dressed up as a ship captain to an elder lich who displayed emotions like a human. However, due to spending time with Shalltear, that latter definition somewhat diminished its rarity. Ainz-sama, what shall we do? Are you satisfied with having brought this ship under your control? Narbaral asked. If he answered in the affirmative, she would likely kill the elder lich on the spot. From her perspective, there would be no reason to spare an undead who had attacked him. Ainz shook his head. That is not my intention. He did not intend to control even this ghost ship with his ability forever. For reasons he didn't yet completely understand, this undead ship seemed to have a considerable amount of HP but was mediocre in all other aspects. It wasn't worth using his ability to control it permanently. In that case, he would need another way to keep this undead ship in his service, and the key to that would be the ship's captain. Are you not using lightning because it would damage this ship? Well, now that your futile efforts are over, shall we proceed? Let's make a deal. If you accept it, I will return this ghost ship to you. Are ye sayin' you're tired of her body so you're returnin' her? Ye beast. No. I'm trying to have a serious conversation here, so listen properly. I've had enough of this, want me to just destroy you instead? Ainz continued, ignoring the undead ship captain nonsense as it grumbled something about eyes be serious too. As ye can see, eyes. No. As you can see, I can easily bring this ship under my control. The same applies to you. However, if you become my subordinate willingly, I swear not to use such methods. Ainz thought he heard a voice saying so yes swings both ways, do yet, but that had to just be his imagination. After all, an undead fighting for its survival wouldn't have the luxury to think about such things. And since there was no way an NPC would say something like that, it was proof enough that it was just Ainz's imagination. Of course, this isn't mercy. Considering my abilities, you should understand without me having to explain. You shall be each other's hostages. If one of you betrays me, I will place the other completely under my control and never release them. It was the lizardman's strategy. The never release part would likely turn out to be a lie. Additionally, this proposal had two problems. First, if the ghost ship didn't have enough intelligence, such a deal wouldn't work. Second, he didn't know whether the ghost ship side had any feelings of care for this undead ship captain. All Ainz could do was pray that it was the case. Or else that this undead ship captain had some special ability it could use to control this ghost ship. HNNRGG, the undead ship captain groaned while appearing to think things over for a while, when it suddenly stamped its feet in frustration, then crawled on its hands and knees, caressing the deck, and finally began to mutter something while rubbing its cheek against the mast. Whether it was struggling with the decision to submit or had simply gone insane was hard to judge. Ainz, finding it somewhat scary to even address it, decided to quietly observe for a while. Eventually, the undead ship captain turned around like a ghostly apparition and opened its mouth to speak while fixing Ainz with a suspicious, resentful gaze. There be something I can't fathom about your proposal. Answer me question. What does ye plan on making us do? It was a difficult question to answer. While they might be useful for transporting large amounts of cargo, frankly speaking, there was no immediate use for them. Whether considering speed, volume, cost, accuracy, safety, or confidentiality, Gate was overwhelmingly superior in every aspect. Unless their territory expanded significantly in the future and both Ainz and Shalltear became too busy to handle Gate operations, it probably wouldn't be needed. He should probably hide his true motive of wanting to collect rare items and give a different reason. Though honestly, he didn't think there would be any problem even if he stated it directly. The undead ship captain would probably just accept it with an "Oh, is that how it be?" However, that didn't seem fitting for someone who served as the leader of the supreme beings that the Guardians worshipped. Originally, there had been a proper reason he had wanted it because it might have been an entity created by unknown technology, like a golem or magical item. But now it was just Ainz's personal desire to possess it because it was rare. After thinking for a moment, unable to come up with a smooth answer that would meet Narbaral's expectations and befit a supreme being, the ruler of Nazarick Ainz played for time. Before discussing that matter, I wish to know how strong you, the two of you are. I want to see the extent of your capabilities. Show me without holding anything back. I didn't make a single mistake. Reflecting on what he had said, Ainz felt pleased with himself. The undead ship's combat capability was still unknown. It seemed unlikely that it had any attacks that could affect Ainz, but of course, he was an outlier in terms of strength in this world. If it possessed above-average strength, he might be able to entrust them with various tasks. There's an undead crab some distance from here. First, I want you to defeat it with the ship's abilities, and if possible, capture it. A crab? What the hell is that? Did that mean the monster's proper name wasn't crab, or did that mean it didn't know what a crab was at all? Ainz waved his hand dismissively at the Elder Lich's question. I shall direct you to the location. Just sail the ship there. Also, what is your name? Grelun for and me wife be the Steel Valkyrie. To be frank, the ship didn't have the looks of a Steel Valkyrie. For one thing, where was the steel? If there had ever been any, it had probably since rusted away. However, Ainz wasn't nearly foolish enough to say that directly. Mocking a name could only anger the other party, and there was nothing to be gained from that. I see. My name is Ainz Ooal. You may call me Ainz. Be sure you don't forget to include Sama. This time, Ainz agreed with Narbaral's intervention. The hierarchy needed to be clearly established. However, demanding that someone attach Sama to his name himself would be uncouth. After all, the inspiration for this name may have come from the large-scale blackfish, referred to as Megana, or regionally Gur. They are a member of the Gyrellini subfamily, which sounds very similar to. Incidentally, they are in the sea chub family, and may be referred to as nibblers. Honorifics should be initiated by the other party. Aye. So ye be called in Sama, then. Grelun said this with slight dissatisfaction. Well, that was to be expected. Without turning around, Ainz could tell that Narbaral was probably wearing an unhappy expression. Then, can you move this ship according to my instructions? Yar. I leaves it to yet, me wife. So, where do we be sailing to? Point your finger and she'll head that away. How this undead ship's perception worked was a highly intriguing matter. Some amorphous species like slimes perceived their surroundings by detecting vibrations, perhaps this was something similar. The Elder Lich who had discovered the crab seemed to still be tracking it, as Ainz could sense its slow movement. It wasn't difficult to indicate the general direction. The ship advanced at a leisurely pace. Though leisurely was relative to Ainz's standards, it was probably faster than an ordinary human could run. The ride wasn't bad. While the Katze plains was flat terrain, there were still some hills. Even in such places, somehow the ship advanced without significant swaying. It would require proper testing to see whether it could move the same way across places with greater differences in elevation, such as mountain ranges, but at least it should work without issue in the vicinity around Irantal. Eventually, after a fair amount of time had passed, they spotted the crab through the thin fog. Having already explored the ship and hearing a rough idea of its capabilities, Ainz commanded Grelun, commence the attack. Just like when they had first encountered this ship, they were in a world of fog with limited visibility. Similarly, the distance wasn't too great between them and their target. Skeletons lined up on the deck, training their crossbows at the crab. Then they fired in unison. The sound of the bolts bouncing off the crab's hard exterior rang out. It seemed none had caused any damage. The crab, though unharmed, recognized that it had been attacked and began to move. It charged straight toward the ship. So, things turned out exactly as I thought they might. But I expected it to take at least some damage. I guess the crab is stronger than I anticipated. The weapons carried by the skeleton crew were rusty crossbows, though that was just their appearance. Their performance had not deteriorated in any way and they possessed no magical effects. If anything, their only special feature was their ability to produce bolts infinitely. While the skeleton crew members seemed stronger than ordinary skeletons, crossbows as weapons fundamentally dealt fixed damage that didn't depend on physical strength, so their increased strength didn't mean much. While the damage could be increased with skills or special bolts, it appeared that they didn't have those either. If they had been using longbows instead, they could have utilized their arm strength, and there might have been a possibility of them inflicting some damage on the crab. In other words, the crossbows were not particularly suitable weapons in this case. Passing through the rain of crossbow bolts unscathed, the crab forcefully rammed into the already decrepit-looking hull of the ship. Despite the impact of its massive body, the ship swayed less than expected. While it looked like it would sink immediately if placed in water, it seemed to have considerable durability. However, if it continues taking attacks like this, then it is only a matter of time until it sinks or is destroyed. The crab's front pair of gangly legs were equipped with disproportionately large pincers, which it raised and brought down. An ominous sound, somewhere between a groan and the creak of distorting wood, echoed through the fog. Due to the angle, they couldn't see the extent of the damage, but it was severe enough to drain the color from Grelun's face as he tried to push through the skeletons to rush forward. Ainz stopped Grelun as he tried to advance over the side of the ship. "I told you, I want to see the ship's capabilities first. How far will ye take this? Are ye blind? A bad matchup it be. If we leaves it be, she'll be scuttled." His frustration had surfaced, making his tone harsh. It probably wasn't an act. It seemed the entirety of the ship's combat power lay in the skeletons, with nothing that could be called a trump card. If so, there was no value in watching the battle any longer. What a shame. I guess this ship won't be much use in battle. From what Grelun had told him, the ship's only special ability was that destroyed skeletons would be replenished after a short time. While that might work if an enemy bothered to fight the skeletons one by one, the ship was vulnerable if an enemy ignored them and attacked it directly. I could man it with my elder liches, or maybe give the skeletons better weapons. I wonder if it would be possible to swap out this ship's equipment? What the hell are ye doin'? Can ye not hear her screams? That be enough, Ainz can't stand it no more. While Ainz was thinking, Grelun's combative tone had escalated further. Narbaral's expression was clearly displeased. It would be unwise to let this go any further. Besides, it wasn't as if Ainz wanted this ship to be destroyed either. Fine. I shall step in. Is that so surprising? I have seen what the ship can do. Now I shall show you my power. Surely you would rather witness my true power than just speculate, right? And after that Ainz smiled, though of course his face didn't move. You can judge whether I'm worthy to be your master. Watching Ainz Ooal gunfight a crab, Grelun felt puzzled. The crab, its proper name was Undead Axe Land Crab, would bring down its pincers, but its attacks seemed to have no effect. This probably wasn't a case of Ainz just putting up a brave front because Grelun was watching. He's blocking physical attacks with magic, belay that, me fireball did not a lick o' damage to him neither. He looks to be a magic caster, so I figure he musta done somethin', but, can ya even block all physical attacks like that? While it was possible he had cast a spell enhanced with silent magic, he still shouldn't be able to nullify everything. The Axeland Crab's namesake pincers combined both bludgeoning and slashing damage attributes in their attacks. So in that case, going by them dashing looks, he should be weak to bludgeoning attacks, so, how th hell's he still in one piece? This was beyond the scope of the knowledge he was born with. Perhaps there were methods to completely nullify one's weaknesses in the world outside the fog? Grelun turned its gaze to the living being beside him, who was likewise observing the battle. An unpleasant feeling, something strange he had never felt before, welled up inside him. Why couldn't he attack? Why couldn't he kill? He suppressed the emotions that were bubbling up. He hadn't asked her name or position, but from what Grelun could tell, this living being appeared to be that detestable hunk's servant. If he gave in to his impulses, he could easily imagine how that undead who could nullify any attack would react. And Grelun's intelligence wasn't so low that he would give in to his instincts despite knowing that. Before their eyes, Ainz struck the crab with a mysterious staff he had pulled from somewhere, sending it flying. He struck it. Wasn't he supposed to be a magic caster? The beast were blown away. Despite the overwhelming difference in size, Ainz's single strike made the crab stumble back, completely losing its balance. What be he? Don't he be a magic caster? He found himself asking the living being despite himself. Ainz-sama is a magic caster. Can you not tell by looking? Or are you so incompetent that you can't even see that much? He wanted to shout that he was asking precisely because he couldn't tell, but he held back the urge. The living being's response was succinct and carried an air of exasperation. In other words, there was no hint of deception. It shivered his timbers. Do this be ordinary in th outside world? Of all the foolish things I've heard, yes, what nonsense. As if he could ever be considered merely ordinary. That person is a supreme being, the king who rules over everything in this world. In intelligence, dignity, and strength. There are none who can match him in any of these aspects. I sees it. So he be a fearsome power even for th outside world. He felt slightly relieved to know that the man trying to dominate him, the man displaying his power before them, was a powerful being. If that man had been a weakling with a pretty face, how pathetic would he be, unable to defeat him and even watching him steal his wife? So the world beyond the fog don't be some realm o' superhuman monsters? Then whereabouts do me own strength rank? A natural question to arise to someone being coaxed out into the outside world, but upon hearing Grelun's words, he heard the living being sigh, "Ha! Are you lacking the function to recognize words? Or is it that you lack comprehension? Didn't I just say? That person stands at the pinnacle of the world. And you call him just a fearsome power? Your words are far too light." Though her expression hadn't changed, her eyes were filled with clear contempt. Even setting aside the fact that she was a living being, it was enough to make him want to kill her, but this woman wasn't someone he could let his guard down against either. She was someone who had remained unfazed after taking 2 casts of his fireball. Even if she had gained resistance to fire through defensive spells, her abilities were extraordinary. She likely had more than enough power to destroy him otherwise, that man wouldn't have left her here. Yet was that the right way to address her? It would be troublesome if he earned her displeasure. But he didn't want to abase himself immediately either. After a brief internal struggle, he used the same form of address as before. Compared to yet, how strong Duan's a shadow flitted across the living being's face, and she turned a bone-chilling glare toward Grelun. It was strong enough to make him experience a new emotion, one known as fear. "Sama, how strong Duan's Sama be? Let me see, greater than the difference between you and a skeleton, I would think. Naturally, that be a whoppin' great fib. It be true." If this living being was extremely weak, he could understand. But his analysis indicated that this wasn't the case. Was she being humble because she was a servant, trying to elevate her master? Besides, why do he have one o' the livin' as a servant? He was able to control me wife, What happened to his undead crew? Don't that en keep undead under his control? That one? Enough, you should be more careful in how you refer to the Supreme One. She twisted her face in displeasure. This was Grelun's mistake. He wasn't so foolish as to not know who Supreme One referred to, given such grandiose words. That be Ainz-sama. Ha, the living being sighed again. Do this live in bane just like Tian? Ainz-sama rules over a wide number of undead. Wide number, So, what be the most common undead among em? The living being's eyes went wide. He hadn't intended to ask anything strange, but perhaps she was going to say that this was another misguided question. The living being furrowed her brow, grimacing. How shameful! To think that I, a creation of the Supreme Beings, cannot even name the types of undead under Insama's command. Yar, a rough reckoning would do fine. A rough reckoning? You ask me to speak carelessly, to speak lies about Insama. The living being must be under the sway of the emotion known as frustration. The same emotion Grelun had felt for the first time when his wife had been stolen from him. That good-looking undead seemed to have thoroughly captivated this living being. If it wasn't through some sort of spell or skill, that alone made in someone to be reckoned with. For Grelun's part, he wanted nothing to do with living subordinates. Surrounded by the living, he would eventually lose control and attack them, no matter how hard he tried to suppress it. Or perhaps with enough time spent among the living, this impulse welling up from the depths of his soul would disappear. Be that as it may, he should probably deal with the living being beside him, who was now muttering to herself as she rattled off the names of various undead. He hadn't expected such a simple question to make her break into a cold sweat. Surely Insama don't be so narrow-minded as to punish ya for your ignorance. So name the undead ya think ya know, even if ya be wrong. The living being was silent for a moment, then, seeming to have reached an answer within herself, she opened her mouth to speak. Zombies. Yo-ho, zombies, it be. The lowest ranking undead. Indeed, there would likely be many zombies. Yes. There are probably more zombies than any other type of undead in Naza, in Insama's base. But when it comes to the undead that Insama has created himself, most likely Death Knights. Death Knights. He had seen one once, long ago. While Grelun was strong, he wasn't sure if he could win against such an undead in ground combat. And moreover created? Did ye say, created? Unconsciously turning his gaze away from the living being, he found himself staring at Ainz, who was performing the inexplicable action of patting the crab while still being struck by it. Yes. Due to my ignorance, I can't say the exact number, but there are so many that I can't even tell you how many hundreds there are. The living being spoke with a tone so serious that it was impossible to think she was lying. Blimey! What madness be this? It couldn't be. There was no way such undead could exist in those numbers. Taking 1,000 steps back, he could barely accept that there might be a single one. No matter how you looked at it, those numbers were impossible. Perhaps the Death Knights this living being knew and the Death Knight Grelun knew were referring to two different things? That was the most likely answer. Do this livin' one be touched in the head? But 1 in 10,000. No, 1 in a billion or even 1 in a trillion chance, if everything she had said was true. Nay, no. But, best be check in to make sure. Grelun described to the living being the appearance of the Death Knight he knew. Then he asked her about the appearance of the Death Knights she knew. This one be addled in th brain, or a bullshitter. That's what they be. Why, I'd wager she ain't even laid eyes on a Death Knight before. It was entirely possible, or rather, it was the only thing that made sense. A Death Knight, you know, be like this? A huge knight it be, pitch black from stem to stern. Well, to express it as from stem to stern isn't quite right, given the prominent red lines. Wieldin' a sinister-lookin' sword, and a massive shield. Do you mean a flamberga and a tower shield? Lettin' loose a dreadful roar, with the white skull peering out o' its helmet. Skull? Really? In that case, the one you speak of might be a rare. I must report this to Insama immediately. Avast! Hold fast there! I misspoke. Its face be rotten and peelin' away. She hadn't fallen for it. This living being undoubtedly knew of Death Knights. She had observed them closely enough to describe details. And despite being able to get that close to a Death Knight, she remained one of the living. All of Grelun's hypotheses had been denied, leaving only one possibility he had been turning a blind eye to. This living being was simply stating facts. Whoa 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 whoa. If this be true, I be in deep waters. I nay, ain't this a stroke o' luck to serve under such a fearsome captain? Hold fast, what's to become o' me position? Or rather, just what sort o' being do this Insama be? That undead began to look more and more like a terrifying monster to him. Oi! Eve! A strange sound escaped him as he shifted his gaze. There floated Ainz, who had been playing with the crab just a moment ago. He was most likely using fly. Have that undead brought aboard the ship. I have placed it under my control, so rough handling shouldn't be a problem, but be careful not to act carelessly since you never know what might happen. What's the matter? What sort o' bearing should I be talking? Now that he knew, he didn't think he could maintain the same attitude as before. However, he didn't want to do an about-face and suddenly start fawning and flattering either. There was no time to think. Grelun rushed to answer. Yes, I understand, he hastily said in his own way. I'll do it, but it ain't like I'm doing it for yet or nothing. Ah! What the hell was that? Then, who are you doing it for? Ainz wanted to ask, but he glanced slightly to check Narberl's reaction, though she showed no particular response. Oh? What's this? Did Narberl say or do something terrifying that made him understand his position? It seemed too extreme a change to be just from watching Ainz's battle with the undead crab, if you could even call it a battle, and realizing the difference in their strengths. So then, had he perhaps considered his situation and thought things through? Ah, I see. Of course. He had composed himself, but witnessing my undead domination ability being used firsthand, the shock of it all came back to him. The realization that he had no way to resist Ainz's undead domination, and no practical method to free the ship, must have made him understand their situation was hopeless. That had to be the reason for his statement. Ainz couldn't think of anything else. Understanding this and feeling relieved as his doubts disappeared, Ainz gave an order to the crab. Obeying his command, the crab frantically clung to the ship's side, trying to climb onto the deck. It was a scene straight out of a B-grade monster panic movie. The only difference was that the skeleton crew were assisting, trying to help haul it onto the ship. Tell me, what fate awaits us, since we couldn't best th crab in battle? There was a slight tension in his voice as Ainz turned to look at him. Ah, your inability to defeat it isn't a problem. As I said earlier, I just wanted to know the extent of your fighting power. Hearing this, Grelun's demeanor relaxed slightly. Then, ye must answer me question from before, but only if ye please. What do ye intend for us? Grelun's manner of speech was somewhat unstable. Well, since he hadn't been using honorifics or humble language until now, it probably wasn't something to worry about. To be blunt, you are all far weaker than I anticipated, and at present, you don't have much value. What? Grelun's demeanor worsened again. Not displeasure or anger, but something else? Is it anxiety about their future? Is he acutely aware of the difference in combat abilities between us? If that was the case, then showing him the battle had served its purpose. Wait. Hold on. Don't be so hasty. What I mean to say is, there is nothing I want from you, in terms of combat. But that doesn't mean you have no value at all. You see, I believe there's merit in having the form of a ship despite being on land. Meanin'. Right. At present, there are no other undead ships that can sail over land. In other words, you all have value simply by existing, and there's currently no specific task that only you could accomplish. In the end, to summarize, he wanted them because they were rare. I can't fathom why a mighty power like Insama would need the likes o' us, but now I spy the truth o' it. There be plenty who can match us in strength, but there ain't many who can boast our unique nature or rarity, that be the heart o' it. That's a good way of putting it. I might borrow that phrase, with some different wording, in the future. While making a mental note, Ainz nodded. That's how it is. Of course, you may be common elsewhere and only rare in these parts, but that's a topic I can deal with if or when the time comes. If we be worth our salt just by existin', and no other crew can fill our boots, are we to be put on display somewhere like a fancy figurehead? No, that won't happen. Simply storing precious things isn't everything. We need to investigate various things whether you can be used outside this land, and if so, what purposes you are suited for. Also, if beings like you are common in other places, we must study your weaknesses, considering the possibility of encountering you as enemies. We'll thoroughly examine every nook and cranny, to see what sort of attacks prove most effective. A fleet of ships that sailed over the land didn't seem particularly powerful, but there might be hidden benefits that Ainz hadn't considered. Or rather perhaps it was fundamentally wrong to think about it from Nazarick's perspective. At the very least, since none of the neighboring nations had magic casters capable of using gate, ships that could transport large amounts of cargo would likely be extremely valuable. Damn yet! To examine her body in detail, down to every nook and cranny. That sounded like it had an entirely different meaning. Ainz slowly closed his eyes. Of course, he had no eyelids. That was when it occurred to Ainz. Maybe this guy is crazy after all. The undead had practically zero sexual desires. For a moment, the face of a certain female vampire created by one of his friends flashed through his mind. He wanted to ignore the thought, but he couldn't quite manage it. Shalltear is way too much of an exception. No, or rather, vampires in general seem to have a lot of exceptional aspects. He remembered someone saying that it was because they were modeled after vampires as they appeared in folklore, but anyway, typical undead didn't experience sexual desire. Even Ainz only retained a tiny bit of sexual desire from the remnants of Suzuki Satoru. This elder lich's statements seemed to be a deviation from this rule. In other words, this is one who has transcended the realm of undead. Ainz considered this as he observed the undead before him. However, he simply couldn't accept that. It was natural to reject acknowledging someone who had deviated in a negative direction. It feels kind of stupid to think about this seriously. Besides, being exceptional in terms of strength is one thing, but being exceptional in terms of sexual desire just makes him sound like a huge pervert. Or maybe there's some hidden purpose behind making himself look like an idiot. I don't get it. Arg. Enough. I haven't heard your answer to my proposal. What will it be? Will you swear eternal loyalty to? Ainz choked on the words. This thing? Should I really accept something this freaky as a subordinate of the sorcerer kingdom of Ainz Ooal? If he were to transport an emissary from another country, what sort of conversation would they have? What if he tells them he entered my service because in addition to cuckolding him, I also blackmailed him? That would be the worst possible outcome. No matter how good a government he promulgated, word of that alone would create a negative evaluation. And what if such stories spread to other countries? Maybe it would be better to just kill him to destroy him. The scales in his heart began tipping from alive to dead. However, a calm part of him, what could be called Ainz's fundamental desire, spoke up. It would be a waste to kill something rare, it whispered. Swallowing a sigh, Ainz asked, pledge loyalty or die alone? Choose quickly, whichever you prefer. I personally recommend the latter. At any rate, this ship couldn't be the only one of its kind. Where there was one, there were likely to be more. Yes. The day might come when he would visit this place again with Cocytus and Demiurge. After all, what was this place really? In a game, it might just be written off as yet, places like this exist, but in this world, the reason for such a phenomenon remained a mystery. The same went for the history of this land, where traces of a past civilization remained. When that time came, Demiurge would surely use his unparalleled intellect to capture several ships. If there were any left, that is. Epilogue. Standing atop the city walls, Antwali gazed southward. In the distance, a thin fog hung in the air, and every time he looked at it, an inexplicable feeling of unease washed over him. When he set foot on the plains, he was too focused to notice, but viewing it from this distance, such emotions would suddenly well up in his chest. Of course, it wasn't because of the undead who made that place their haven. That thin fog would clear during the battles between the Empire and the Kingdom, only to settle again in the same place when the fighting subsided. What's more, it never spread not even by a single centimeter. When faced with something so decisively different from normal weather patterns, one couldn't help but sense an overwhelmingly powerful presence that humans could never hope to resist. It was something akin to the vastness of the Azurlizia Mountains that could be seen in the distance. What shall we do now? One of the companions standing next to Antwali posed the question. They should have discussed this earlier, but they couldn't exactly do so on the return journey. Skeletal dragons had appeared in a place previously thought to be largely secure. Considering that the situation on the plains had changed, they couldn't afford to let their guard down, and idle chatter was out of the question. Going to the Sorcerer Kingdom right now would be unwise. We shouldn't do that until Momonga returns. No, even after he returns, we shouldn't go until we understand the situation. I wonder what kind of horrible things are happening in the Sorcerer Kingdom right now. The hitherto unconfirmed ghost ship of the Katze plains, something that until now existed only in drunken tavern tales, a presence found only in dubious rumors. What purpose did the Prime Minister of the Sorcerer Kingdom have in requesting Momonga to find it? There were 3 possible reasons to consider. The first was that she believed only Momonga could find it. The second was that the Sorcerer Kingdom wanted to advance some agenda that they couldn't pursue while Momonga was present, so they needed to send him far away. Upon investigation, it seemed Momonga had been at odds with the Sorcerer Kingdom over the treatment of its residents. That must be what this was about. Since it's something they can't do without driving that hero away, Uncle thinks it must be something incredibly inhumane. It rubs me the wrong way. Using an official request to eliminate any right of refusal, forcing him to accept the job whether he likes it or not. I suppose if Momonga had refused, that would have been that, but, they exploited his weakness as an adventurer, didn't they? He should have just become a worker. But that wouldn't work, would it? The Sorcerer Kingdom's aim might be to drive a wedge between the Adventurers Guild and Momonga. There were many potential benefits to separating him from the organization. I hear the Prime Minister of the Sorcerer Kingdom isn't human. I hate to praise her, but there's no doubt she's a sharp cookie. If they commit atrocities against the people, have they not considered that Momonga might become enraged or hostile when he returns and learns of it? They probably have a plan to deal with that too. By the time he returns, it would be too late to do anything. What if they're aiming for something irreversible, like a massacre, rather than something like legal reforms? No, but even supposing that's the case, that would make Momonga a potential enemy, wouldn't it? Is that what the Sorcerer Kingdom is aiming for? You think making Momonga an enemy is part of their goal? Their companions voiced their thoughts one after another. Having an adamantite-ranked adventurer under their command, or at least in a cooperative relationship, was quite significant. Under normal circumstances, it would be nothing but advantageous. However, that meant they would only turn Momonga into an enemy if there were even greater benefits to be gained. No such benefits came to mind through normal reasoning. However, this was the Sorcerer Kingdom they were talking about, the nation that could summon horrific monsters with a single spell and trample countless humans. They had to have something in mind. Perhaps rather than making him an enemy, they're planning something to ensure he becomes an ally, some way to make it impossible for him to betray them. That's right. Uncle was suspecting it might be more like a collar than an alliance. Well, that Bane said, I can't think of any specific examples of what that might entail. They might learn something if they went to the Sorcerer Kingdom, but they had no desire to do so. Momonga probably understands all this too, but did he accept because he has a counter move that could overturn their plans? Everyone fell silent at once. The third reason. It sat heavily in the pits of their stomachs. For both Momonga and Antwali's party, this would be the worst possible reason. This was common knowledge, but during the annual war with the kingdom, the Sorcerer Kingdom had claimed this land originally belonged to us, and the kingdom is illegally occupying it. Of course, no one bought such a story. However, thinking about it calmly, it was curious to note that the Katze Plains, a land notorious for frequently birthing undead, lay in the territory that the undead claimed to once have ruled. Was this purely a coincidence? If it wasn't, could the Sorcerer Kingdom have been marshalling its forces within the fog? Was that why they had information about the ghost ship that no one else knew about because it was their own military asset? If that was the case, it was a trap. This place was the bottom of a cauldron where the most horrific aspects of the Sorcerer Kingdom had been distilled. If they intended to make this place an execution ground to consign an uncontrollable hero to darkness, wouldn't that explain why multiple skeletal dragons had appeared? Though Momon had dispatched them with ease, even he might be in danger if that class of undead kept coming in quick succession. However, if such ulterior motives existed, they couldn't understand why the Sorcerer Kingdom wasn't pressuring the free city of Vadis to cease its operations. After all, Antwali and his companions had been whittling down the Sorcerer Kingdom's military strength, albeit on a small scale, and preventing them from building up their forces. This should have been an activity that they would want to have stopped immediately. Perhaps the Sorcerer Kingdom meant to suggest that undead weak enough to be easily defeated weren't needed as military assets, that they were just allowing them to be culled. Or perhaps the Sorcerer Kingdom was deceiving them by making them think they were successfully exterminating the undead, while in the depths of the fog they amassed an even more accursed army. Something didn't sit right with any of these hypotheses. It was precisely because most of the pieces fit together that the few discrepancies heightened their anxiety. It gave them the sensation that they were overlooking something critical. As they stood thinking in silence, they spotted something moving beyond the thin, undulating fog. No one on the team failed to notice it. It was something huge, about the size of a mansion. Such a thing was trying to emerge from within the writhing fog. What should they do? Should they raise an alarm just because a shadowy presence moved beyond the fog? There was a considerable distance between them, and the fog was present. They couldn't completely rule out the possibility that they had misjudged its size. As they glared beyond the fog is spreading. This was an anomaly. The fog that had never moved before was now expanding its range. Perhaps the appearance of the skeletal dragons wasn't because they had been brought from the depths, but because an anomaly was occurring. Or perhaps they had been harbingers of things to come. Quickly hold it. Anyone can see the fog is spreading. We should at least look at that. It was a ship. A ship was gliding across the land. Impossible. It can't be. The ship glided past the perimeter of the city, emerging onto the main road, before continuing toward the road that led to the Sorcerer Kingdom. Their line of sight was clear for only a brief moment, but within the fog, they saw two figures standing on the ship's deck. The tall figure in armor uncrossed their arms and pointed into the distance, their crimson cloak billowing dramatically in the wind. The ship slowly changed course as if obeying, heading away from Vadis. Was this his doing? Yes. It was the two members of darkness. The figures of Momon and Nabe. They didn't appear to have been turned into undead. They didn't understand. Should they conclude that there was no ulterior motive? Had the Sorcerer Kingdom sent Momon out simply because they believed he could do it? Or did Momon-sama outmaneuver the Sorcerer Kingdom's aims? No, was this his countermove? Hearing Antwali's muttering, his companions exclaimed, "Ah, and I see." The three potential reasons mentioned earlier. There was one perfect solution that could be applied regardless of which reason was correct. That was no matter what conspiracy the Sorcerer Kingdom had planned, no matter what forces they had assembled, he could complete the job with overwhelming strength and speed far beyond their expectations, and return to Irantal before they could do anything. But was such a thing possible? Under circumstances where no one had been able to find such a thing until now, where there wasn't even any reliable information, no, the scene before their eyes was the truth. Ha, Antwali let out a sigh of admiration. Once upon a time, there was a terrifying skeleton king. The skeleton king sought to make his people suffer, but a warrior stood in his way to protect them. So this is what it means to be at the highest rank of adventurers, adamantite rank. They were living in different worlds. The skeleton king used the demons in his thrall to try to trap the warrior through the most wicked means imaginable. He's an amazing person, isn't he, Momon-san? The companions silently agreed with these words. They had encountered several people before that they couldn't hope to defeat, but Momon stood at the pinnacle of them all. But the warrior outwitted the villain with wisdom and valor, breaking through his dastardly schemes. And they all lived happily ever after. Had. Antwali laughed. I suppose I have no talent as a bard. But, to be able to witness a heroic tale worthy of song unfold before my very eyes, this kind of happiness isn't so bad either. The ghost ship was receding along with the fog. No, it would be more accurate to say that the ghost ship disappeared into the fog, and then the fog began to fade away. For a little while, Antwali and the others continued to silently gaze in the direction of Irantal, where the ghost ship had disappeared. After seeing off the ship that had now completely disappeared, the party mentioned a certain something. Though it had been an unbelievable sight, it certainly wasn't an illusion. In fact, everyone had seen it. That something was the presence of a creature that had been planted firmly on the deck. It was what appeared to be a crab. Hey, why was there a crab on that ghost ship? This can't be the case, but maybe it was out fishing. Would have looked mighty fittin' with a big catch flag. Seriously, what was that all about? No one could provide a satisfactory answer to that question. Information source text, Hittery additional editing, Fire Dragon 1X and P-Dragon 18 version, 1.0, 010825.